Hello and welcome to my first video of a new series, a Middle-earth map tour. I know how much people love maps, I do too, but the map of Middle-earth is a large, highly detailed map, filled with names and places that you might not have ever heard of. You might have looked at the map and wondered what that label is, what happened there, who lives there, and did it serve a purpose? So in this series, I'll be going through the map in detail, the forests, mountains, cities, etc. But in this video, we shall start with perhaps the most interesting places of all. Ruins. Middle-earth is a place that is filled with lots of ruins. The end of the Third Age is basically a dark age for the free peoples in the west of Middle-earth, and as such, there's a lot of places around that are relics of better, more glorious times. So in this video, I'll be going through all the major ruins on the map, whether they belong to good or evil, and I'll also be including some places that aren't on the map. So if you've got the geography of Middle-earth sorted, you might still want to hang around for that. We'll start in the west, and at one of my favourite places in Middle-earth, although I've never been there so I can't say for sure, and that place is Annúminas. Annúminas was the first capital of Arnor, founded by Elendil by the shores of Lake Nenwial in 3320 of the Second Age. It served as Elendil's capital, but unfortunately the city's golden era was extremely brief, as the population of Arnor dwindled due to losses sustained during the War of the Last Alliance. Annúminas shared this fate, and while the city remained the capital during the reign of Valandil, Isildur's youngest son, which ended in 249 of the Third Age, the details of the city's fate afterwards are murky. We do know that when Arnor split in 861 of the Third Age, the first king of Arthedain was known as Amleth of Fornos, suggesting that he was probably the one who moved the capital to Fornos. Whether Annúminas was partially or almost fully deserted by this point is unknown, but it's a reasonable assumption to make that the city didn't last much longer than this, and that's the way Annúminas remained for the rest of the Third Age, a silent city by the lake, a symbol of the hope of Elendil, but also a symbol of the decay that quickly followed him. It wasn't a city ruined by war, it was a city that was ruined by depopulation because there wasn't enough people around to even live in it. But Annúminas did not stay a ruin forever. It was the first place Aragorn aimed to restore, and it's said that he dwelt there whenever he visited the Northern Lands in the Fourth Age. As you might have noticed, it's impossible to talk about the history of Annúminas without mentioning Fornos, and Fornos Dorain is the next stop on our list. Like Annúminas, it was founded by Elendil in 3320 of the Second Age, nestled at the southern feet of the hills known as the North Downs. Given its name means Northern Fortress, it probably wasn't intended to be the main city of Arnor. But as I mentioned earlier, the population of Arnor dwindled, and for one reason or another, it surpassed Annúminas in importance. By 861, it was the capital of Arthedain, and Annúminas had fallen into ruins. From Fornos, the heirs of Isildur would rule the kingdom of Arthedain, first fighting in wars against the fellow successor states of Cardolan and Rhudaur, and then against the Witch King's realm of Angmar. As the rest of Arnor fell, Fornos endured, even surviving an attack on the city in 1409. But despite the best efforts of the Dunedain, they were eventually outmatched by Angmar, and in 1974, during a dark winter, Angmar's forces attacked and seized the city. The surviving Dunedain were forced to flee, as was their last king, Arvedui. In celebration, the Witch King took Fornos as his new seat of power, and filled it with his terrible people. But this did not last long at all. The next year, an army from Gondor arrived to the north, and the Witch King foolishly gave battle outside the city, where he was crushed. Fornos was cleared of enemies, but the remaining Dunedain were too few to inhabit it, and it was left in ruins, overgrown by grass, and ominously named Dead Men's Dyke by the men of Bree, who believed it to be haunted. Whether it was truly haunted or not is unknown, but the Rangers of the North would occasionally visit the place. But like Annúminas, Fornos' final fate wasn't so sad, as according to Gandalf, Aragorn intended on restoring it. When that happened is unknown. The next town, believe it or not, is also in Arnor. That's what happens when the kingdom falls, they leave a lot of ruins behind. This is the town of Thebad. It was an important site going back to the early years of the Second Age, and there may have even been a settlement there in those years. But with the founding of Arnor and Gondor in 3320 of the Second Age, the site was extensively developed. A large bridge was built across the Gwathlo, the nearby swamps were drained, the river was deepened, a port was built, and a town sprung up on the site. It was for many years jointly manned by both Gondor and Arnor, who maintained a garrison of engineers, mariners, and soldiers. But with Arnor and Gondor's decline, Thebad became increasingly independent. Gondor withdrew from the town following the Great Plague of 1636, and while the town was technically still part of Arnor during this time, Arnor's power was mostly confined to the north of Eriador. Thanks to Thebad's isolation, the town survived the Angmar Wars, whereas most of the rest of the kingdom did not. However, this only meant that Thebad would suffer a slow, painful decline. The Númenóreans and their Dunedain descendants had defied nature to maintain the town, and with the loss of that expertise, nature began to take a toll. Over the next 1,000 years following the fall of Arnor, Thebad would decline, and eventually the town came to an end in 2912. Thanks to devastating floods that followed the Fell Winter, the town was left ruined and deserted, and 100 years later, when Boromir sought to pass on his journey to Rivendell, it was not in a great shape. The bridge had collapsed, the roads were overgrown, and the causeways on either side of the river had crumbled. Boromir braved the crossing, and although he was successful, he lost his horse in the attempt. Owing to Thebad's important location, it's probable that it was rebuilt in the 4th Age, but we don't know when or by whom. Earlier I mentioned how Fornos rendered Annúminas obsolete. Well, Thebad did that as well, and that was to the port of Lere, further down the river Gwathlo. Now, Lere was not built by Arnor. It was built by the Númenóreans around 800 of the Second Age and was originally known as Vignalonde. At the time, Eriador was covered in large forests, so Vignalonde served primarily as a port for timber. But these forests were destroyed following the War of the Elves and Sauron in the late 17th century, and Númenórean attention soon turned southwards. Vignalonde, then known as Londere Aned, or the Great Middle Harbour, began to decline in importance. And unfortunately, we don't know much else about Londere. It's possible it was destroyed in the downfall of Númenor, the coastlines of Middle-earth were battered, but even if it survived, its importance was surpassed by the newly built port of Thebad, mostly owing to Londere's isolation. It seems probable that Londere, like many other places in Arnor, was abandoned fairly early in the Third Age and has been a ruin ever since. In saying that, we don't know for certain. It may have survived much longer, but it's a fairly safe bet that by the time of the War of the Ring, Londere was just another ruin from far better days. Alright, let's away from Arnor and go to a place that is next to Arnor, and was ultimately responsible for its destruction. Angmar, and more specifically, the fortress of Khand Dûm. The foundation of Khand Dûm is shrouded in mystery. While men lived there at the time, we can only say for certain that the fortress there was founded around 1300 of the Third Age, when the Witch King came to Angmar. And from that fortress, the Witch King would wage wars upon Arnor, and Khand Dûm even survived an attack by the elves around 1409. Finally, the Witch King gained the upper hand, and Arnor was destroyed in 1974. But Angmar's destruction quickly followed. The Witch King was defeated at Fornos, but when he fled to Angmar, his enemies pursued him, and so far was the host of the West that not a single man or orc of Angmar was left remaining west of the Misty Mountains. So it's a safe assumption that Khand Dûm was utterly destroyed during this time. After all, it's never mentioned again. That said, orcs did later reoccupy the Misty Mountains in force, so if Khand Dûm's ruins do still exist somewhere, then it's possible that they might just be another orc-filled hellhole. Moving further south, we arrive at the famous dwarven kingdom of Khazad-dûm, or more well known as Moria. Moria's exact foundation is unknown. It was in the long years of the First Age, so by the time of the Second Age, it was already thousands of years old. These were Moria's glory years, swelled by refugees from the other dwarven kingdoms and in close friendship with the elves of Eregion. But the War of the Elves and Sauron ended this golden age. Eregion was destroyed, the dwarves closed their gates, and in the dark of Moria, Durin's folk began to dwindle. That said, many thousands years passed before Moria became the ominous ruin it came to be. In 1980 of the Third Age, while delving ever deeper for Mithril, the dwarves awoke a Balrog, Durin's bane. King Durin VI was killed, and his son Nain I died the following year. The dwarves abandoned Moria, eventually settling in places like Erebor and the Grey Mountains. Moria itself remained empty for centuries, well, except for the Balrog. But in the late 25th century, orcs began to settle in. Although their number was reduced during the bloody War of the Dwarves and Orcs in the late 28th century, the dwarves lacked the strength to reclaim their lost kingdom. nor did they have a way to deal with Durin's Bane. This didn't dissuade Balin, who managed to retake the city and maintain a colony there between 2989 and 2994. Unfortunately, this colony ran into some minor problems, and everyone died, including Balin. When the Fellowship passed through, they were attacked by orcs and by Durin's Bane, but despite resulting in the temporary loss of Gandalf, Durin's Bane was killed. This meant that the reclamation of Moria was now an actual possibility, and sometime in the Fourth Age, Durin the Seventh would recapture the city for Durin's folk. Moving much further to the south, we find ourselves at an old elven port in the heart of Gondor. This is the port of Ethelon. There are two separate stories that speak of the foundation of Ethelon, the first stating that it was founded by elven refugees from Beleriand in the First Age, and the second stating that it was founded by discontent Sindar in the early Second Age. Regardless, the first settlers were soon joined by Sylvan Elves, some of whom had made their way down to the sea, even living at places such as the mouth of the Anduin. Following the War of the Elves and Sauron in the mid-Second Age, elves began to leave Middle-earth in greater numbers, Ethelon being the primary port for those that did not wish to leave west of the Misty Mountains. By the 20th century of the Third Age, only a few elves remained in Ethelon, and the end of the port would come shortly afterwards. In 1980, the Balrog awoke in Moria, leading to a large exodus of elves from Lothlorien. Amongst these were King Amroth and his would-be lover Nimrodel. As the tale goes, the company was separated from each other, and when Amroth reached Ethelon, only one ship remained. Amroth and the remaining sailors would have waited, but a storm battered the port, and the ship they were taking refuge on was torn from its moorings. I'm not sure why they were taking refuge on a ship. It was swept out to sea, but Amroth dove overboard and attempted to reach the shore. He was never seen again, and elves never inhabited Ethelon again. It remained as a ruin, not far from the Gondorian city at Dol Amroth, which took its name from the drowned elven king. To the people of Dol Amroth, the story of Amroth and Nimrodel remained an important part of their identity, and the abandoned port of Ethelon was proof of the time that elves lived near to among them. Next is perhaps the most famous ruin in Middle-earth, the Citadel of Stars, the old capital of Gondor, Osgiliath. It was founded on either side of the Anduin in 3320 by the sons of Elendil, Isildur and Anarion, who had their thrones next to each other. Among its great monuments were the Dome of the Stars and the great stone bridge across the Anduin, upon which there were entire houses and towers. For the first 1500 years or so of its existence, Osgiliath was perhaps one of the greatest cities that had ever been built in Middle-earth. But as Gondor's power waned, so did Osgiliath. The first wound was self-inflicted. In 1437, the city was sacked by the forces of Castamir the Usurper, and the Dome of the Stars was ruined. 200 years later, the Great Plague ripped through Gondor, and the highly populated city of Osgiliath was heavily affected, leading to many fleeing the city and starting new lives in the countryside of Anorion and Ithilien, refusing to return. As a result, only 3 years later, King Torondor, perhaps recognizing the writing on the wall, moved his new capital to Minas Anor, later known as Minas Tirith. If there was a chance of reviving the city, it ended in 2002, when Minas Ithil fell to the Nazgul, becoming Minas Morgul. With an enemy fortress merely a day's march from the city, even more people fled, and entire sections of the city were now deserted, leading to people believing that it was haunted. The city did survive another 473 years, thanks to the Watchful Peace, but in 2475, orcs burst out of Mordor and Osgiliath was taken. Although it was swiftly recaptured, the damage had been done. The Great Stone Bridge was broken, and the final civilian inhabitants had now fled, never to return. What was once the glorious capital of Gondor was now the front line in the war against Mordor. Over the next few centuries, Osgiliath would change hands multiple times, doing even more damage to the ruined city. Around 2940, Gondor did manage to recapture the entire city and held it for the next 70 years, even rebuilding a bridge across the river. But in June 3018, Sauron launched a surprise assault and took the eastern half of the city. In March 3019, he launched his great invasion of Gondor, and after about 2 days of fighting, the western half was taken as well. This would be the final time that the city would be a battleground, as not even 2 weeks later, Sauron was destroyed and the war was over. As for the final fate of Osgiliath, interestingly, Tolkien doesn't tell us. But like Thebad, Osgiliath occupied a strategically important location, so it would make sense for it to be rebuilt. Also, it would be kind of weird to just have this giant ruin sitting within inside of your capital city when you could totally just rebuild it. All that said, it's probably unlikely that it would become the capital of Gondor again, given how culturally important Minas Tirith had become to modern Gondorians. So these are all the places on the map, but like I said at the start of the video, there's a few major ruins that don't appear on the map. Some of these have speculated locations, whereas others we know the exact location. Let's start with two major ruins that are leftovers from the First Age, Nogrod and Belegost, the dwarven cities that belong to the Broadbeams and the Firebeards. Founded sometime in the First Age around Mount Dolmed, the dwarves of these two cities played a major role in the war against Morgoth, and in the case of Nogrod, unfortunately, they were also caught up in the fate of the Silmarils. But despite the Blue Mountains mostly surviving the cataclysm that destroyed Beleriand, Nogrod and Belegost did not. Even though they didn't sink into the sea, they were still so badly damaged that the dwarves of the Blue Mountains decided against rebuilding them, and instead, most of them migrated west to Moria. Some dwarves remained behind, and the Blue Mountains still had a dwarven presence by the end of the Third Age, but they had built new settlements on the eastern side of the mountains. Nogrod and Belegost remained ruined and abandoned. The next ruin has a sad, sad fate. This was Ost in Ethil, the capital of the relatively brief elven realm of Eregion. While Eregion was founded in 700 of the Second Age, we don't quite know who was responsible. It was either Galadriel and Celeborn or Celebrimbor, the last of the House of Feanor. In 750, the city of Ost in Ethil was built, not within sight of Moria, but relatively close, probably along the river Ciranon. It was due to this relative closeness that the dwarves and elves struck up a close friendship. Unfortunately, Ost in Ethil was also where Sauron found his success in his quest to deceive the elves. Galadriel and Celeborn were effectively ousted from power, although non-violently, and Celebrimbor and his smiths, the Gwaith I Mirdain, took control. From 1200 onwards, Sauron influenced these smiths, eventually culminating in the crafting of the Rings of Power between 1500 and 1600. This was a ploy by Sauron to dominate the elves, but the elves realised the deception after Celebrimbor crafted the three elven rings without Sauron's knowledge. This led to the War of the Elves and Sauron in 1693, and by 1695 Sauron had besieged Eregion. 2 years later, Ost in Ethil was stormed, the Rings of Power were taken, and Celebrimbor was taken captive and then executed. Although some elves managed to escape the ruin, founding Rivendell in the north, Eregion nor Ost in Ethil were ever rebuilt following Sauron's defeat. In fact, the land remained totally deserted even 5,000 years later, and when the Fellowship passed through, they could still see the ruins of old Eregion, although not Ost in Ethil itself. The last ruin is a relatively recent one in terms of the long history of Middle-earth, and that is the ruin of Framsburg. In 1856 of the Third Age, the Northman Kingdom of Rhovanion was destroyed by the Wainrider Easterlings, and the survivors fled west to the Vales of Anduin, becoming known as the Aethiod. After dwelling near to the Carrock and the Gladden Fields for about a century, they eventually moved further north to the Upper Vales of Anduin in 1977. Presumably that same year, they founded the city of Framsburg, north of the confluence of the rivers Greylin and Langwell. The city was likely founded by Frumgar, the lord of the Aethiod at the time, but it was seemingly named after his son Fram, who would go on to become the legendary slayer of the dragon Scatha. Nothing else is really known about Framsburg. It likely served as the capital of the Aethiod for the next 500 years, but in 2510 the Aethiod received a call for aid from Gondor. The legendary ride of Eöl the Young and his army resulted in the salvation of Gondor's army led by steward Cirion in the Battle of the Field of Celebrant. As a reward, Cirion gifted Eöl the land of Calenadon, Rohan. This resulted in the Aethiod mass migrating to their new land in the south. As for Framsburg, it was most likely deserted, and by the War of the Ring, all that would have remained was ruins. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. I want to say that starting this series doesn't mean Middle-earth Mysteries has come to an end. There will still be more of those videos when I can find interesting topics to talk about. Please leave feedback if you think I should change anything about the video style for this series, because I want it to be as consistent as possible, so the sooner the better. Cheers, farewell, and remember, Big Macs are better than Quarter Pounders.